As an employer, I don't want to be competing with slavery. I don't want that, you know? I don't find that moral or financial calculation actually that difficult to do. What everybody's talking about with farm labor is the ICE raids, because they are out in the streets, in public, in a city where there's a lot of other people to see it. So the ICE raids are getting all the attention. But you need to know that the ICE raids are only half the story. And today we're going to talk about the other half of what's going on with farm labor. What happens when all the undocumented workers are locked up or expelled from the country? Then what? And that's the question everybody's been asking, right? What were farmers thinking when they voted for this? When they voted for a guy who promised to expel all their workers from the country? I'm a small farmer, and I came up in farming as a farm worker. I am an American, but I did those field jobs on farms that everybody thinks Americans won't do. And that's why I can tell you it is a lot more complicated than just Americans won't do that. So we're going to talk about some of the inside story about why U.S. farmers thought it was a good idea to expel their own workers from the country, what they thought was going to happen after that, and how it's a lot worse than you probably imagined. I think the main thing that folks need to understand about farm labor is farmers will get their workers no matter what. One way or the other, they'll get them. And so the question is not will farmers get their workers? The question is how will farmers get their workers? For the last couple decades or so, it's been a lot of undocumented labor. It's been a lot of undocumented people coming across the border on their own. As someone who has been a coworker with a lot of these folks, I like to call them freelance because it really drives home the fact that they're just gig workers. They can pick up and go to the next job whenever they want. A lot of farm employers, farmers, the people who hire farm workers, don't like that. They don't like the fact that there are all these workers that they depend on, but if the job's not good, if it's not paying enough, if they're not being treated well, they can just leave. And that's a problem for a lot of farm employers. Speaking as a small farmer, there's a lot of things that my fellow farmers don't like about undocumented workers. And it's not the fact that they're illegal, it's the fact that they can pick up and leave at any time. A lot of farm employers wind up resorting to threats, I'm going to call ICE on you, to basically get people to stay even when the job conditions are bad. And the big problem with that is it's a lot of work. Even though the workers are cheap, it's a bit of a management headache. And that's also a big part of why they don't like hiring US citizens either. And they'll give you this whole thing about how Americans don't want to do the hard work. I would point out that I live in Fayetteville, North Carolina, next to Fort Bragg, which is home to tens of thousands of people who volunteered to work hard outdoors, getting shot at, for not a whole lot of pay. So you cannot tell me that Americans don't want to work hard is the problem. There's more to it than that. The big thing about farm labor is it's a dead-end job. And I've done some videos on why and what we could do to change that. That's a whole nother thing besides what we're talking about today. The bottom line is, yeah, Americans are totally willing to work hard. The thing is, if the hard work that you have is a dead-end job, then the Americans who are willing to work hard will go do that hard work somewhere else, where that hard work is going to pay off. So it's not that Americans don't want to work hard, it's that we want there to be a point to working hard. So that's the issue here. There's a few other things too, but that's really the big one. So rather than deciding to build livelihoods that Americans want, the US farm sector has decided we'll just hire immigrants instead. Now, when most people hear farm workers, they usually think undocumented. And that is true. Many of my coworkers are undocumented. However, there is an actual legal visa immigration program for farm workers. It's called H-2A. So that's what we're going to spend a lot of this video talking about. Farmers have gripes with the H-2A program because it's expensive. Workers have gripes with the H-2A program because slavery that happens under the table with that thing. So yeah, you can have a farm labor program that is so not functional that you have both overcharging and slavery. The H-2A system is proof that you really can have it all. First, let's talk about what farmers don't like about the H-2A program. And I will say farmers don't like the H-2A program with a big ol' asterisk, because if you look at how many farmers are hiring H-2A workers, the number is going up very rapidly every single year. It's kind of funny to me how much the farm sector insists they don't like the H-2A program and it has to be changed or they all go bankrupt, because they keep hiring more and more H-2A workers every single year. Which is, it kind of feels like the market telling you it's working. This is the problem with letting women go to college. They learn economics and start getting ideas. There are other issues that farmers take with the H-2A program, like there's a lot of paperwork. We're going to get into that later. And because these workers are not local, you're having to get them from another country. That means they need housing. They don't already have a place near you where they live, so you have to take care of that. That's part of it. They don't have a car locally, so they can't go buy groceries, so you got to provide food one way or the other. And then you also have to provide transportation for them to get from their home to wherever you're having them work. These are all extra costs that the farm sector loves to complain about at length. I would just simply point out that you don't have to pay for any of that stuff if you hire Americans. They never like that. I've done work for farm clients where I live on the road and I have to come travel to them, and they understand that comes with extra costs. I'm doing things for them that locals cannot or will not do. And so when I do it, now that I've worked my way up to white collar farm worker status, when I do that, they don't complain about, oh, but I have to pay for you to fly here and put you up in a hotel. And like when you buy a meal, then we have to pay for that. That's understood to be part of the cost that comes with hiring somebody from out of town. But when it comes to manual labor farm workers, all of a sudden that's just too much. That's interesting to me. If you ever work your way up from manual field labor to white collar farm work, like doing administrative and consulting work for farms, believe it or not, you were treated very, very differently. And that is one of those things that really struck out to me was how if you're a white collar worker, the fact that travel needs to be paid for is just, of course, no one questions that. If you're blue collar, it becomes suddenly, how dare you? These are all costs that you would not have to pay for if you'd hired locals, but you won't do that. Another thing that farmers will really point to as a problem with the H-2A program is the wages. There's a minimum wage. That minimum wage is pegged to how much would it take to get an American to do this job in your area. So that's going to vary by state. If it's got a higher cost of living like California, that minimum wage is higher. They call it the adverse effect wage rate. So it's basically like the wage below which you cannot go or Americans won't take it. That's the adverse effect, right? So it's AEWR. It's just a minimum wage. The minimum wage for H-2A farm labor here in North Carolina, last I heard, $16 an hour. Big update. The Trump administration just lowered this minimum wage for H-2A workers. So that's something farmers were really hoping for. Really shed some light on why they were so eager to vote for this guy, despite him destroying their markets. There's a mentality that as long as we don't have to pay for anything that we need done, then we'll make money no matter what happens. Some of us may come up with different math on that, but that was the mentality a lot of people had, and that's a big part of why people voted for this. So those are the challenges that farmers cite with the H-2A program. That'll be things like there's a minimum wage they don't want to pay. There's a lot of paperwork because we want to make sure that people coming into this country are, we know who they are, like, because that's the whole thing with legal immigration, right? We need to make them stop at the border and tell us who they are and vet them a little bit. Well, that's called paperwork. And so when you're doing an H-2A visa and hiring documented workers, someone has to pay for that paperwork. The bureaucrats down at the consulate don't work for free. Extra costs for housing, transportation, and food, that's just part of the deal when you hire folks from out of town. But those are the issues that a lot of farmers have with the H-2A program. Now let's talk about the issues that workers have experienced with the H-2A program. The big one, already mentioned it, slavery. There have been multiple cases of people who were brought into this country legally on H-2A visas and then had their passports taken, so they couldn't leave. They couldn't leave the job. They couldn't leave the country. They were held prisoner, right? They were forced to work a lot more than they were supposed to, sometimes under the table for extra clients for people they were not supposed to be assigned to work for. The way the H-2A visa works is you have a visa to work for that employer. And so, often these folks are like, okay, you do the full day's work for that employer, and then we bring you over somewhere else and make you do some more work that you may or may not get paid for. People not getting enough food, people having to live in really filthy conditions with no running water, with a lot of bugs. I don't know how you're supposed to pick crops and keep it clean if you can't do laundry and you can't wash your hands. Make that make sense. We have a lot of cases where people were not paid what they were supposed to be paid. That minimum wage was not filled. Sometimes what they were paid was very low. And sometimes people are threatened. You have to work harder or we will beat you. You have to work harder or we will sexually assault you on the job. Or sometimes that would just happen anyway. A real classic one they use, though, is you have to work harder or we will get your wife and family back home. This is a pretty common tactic that H-2A contractors use. Hey, I've got contacts back in Mexico. That's how, we got you funneled into working for this company. We know people back home who know your family. And if you don't work hard enough, if you don't work fast enough, if you try to tell the police, if you try to run away, we will murder your family back home. That is a not uncommon tactic that H-2A employers will use. And if you are being held captive, you can't leave. You are not getting paid much, if anything. You're being sexually assaulted at work, and you're having your family threatened if you try to say anything or leave. If that's not slavery, I don't know what is. And this is happening to people who come into this country legally, who go through the extra effort to make sure that they are documented, who go through the effort to do everything right. If you can do everything right and still have this happen to you, I gotta ask you, what is the point? Why should people follow the law when this is what following the law gets you? To its credit, the U.S. did recognize that this was a problem and put in some big anti-slavery provisions into the H-2A program back in 2024. A big part of why that happened, largely in response to the biggest modern-day slavery bust in recent U.S. history. That was in 2021 in Georgia. And actually did some work around there at that time, and I can tell you it was an open secret. People knew it was happening. It still took a several-year investigation to take that ring down. I'm not clear on how many people they had wrapped up in that but that slavery ring in southern Georgia had made $200 million. So, slavery is a big business. There's a lot of money to be made in forcing other people to work for you and not giving them anything back. Just something to think about. Because there are a lot of hoops to jump through with hiring people through H2A, you can't just go to Home Depot and pick people up. You have to actually do paperwork and stuff because there's official vetting. That's how it is. When a farm has to do that paperwork, it feels very stressful. It's a lot of work. And there's also the whole thing with where the workers need housing, transportation, food. That's a lot of extra work on top of what farms already do, like plant crops, harvest them. So a lot of farms are like, well, that's too much. I can't do that myself. What they will do is they will hire an H2A labor contractor. So an H2A labor contractor is just a temp agency for farms, right? So a quirk of the H2A system is it's not here's your ticket to enter the country and go find a job. It's more like a matchmaking service. So as a worker, you apply for an H2A visa and a job, and also the employers apply to hire H2A workers. So then the H2A system is like a matchmaker matching people up. So when you have that H2A visa, you can only work for that employer that you got matched to. So every farm might only need people for 2 to 6 weeks. So that's a lot of paperwork to do just to hire people for 2 to 6 weeks. So a cool trick that people figured out was, what if I just hire people through a temp agency and then they work for the temp agency? That's their employer, and then the temp agency can just rent them out to different farms when they need them. So that's how the H2A system actually kind of works in practice. Most of them work for temp agencies instead of farms themselves. So that adds a lot of convenience for the farms. They get to skip a lot of the paperwork and the providing the necessities of living for the employees. The downside is when a lot of the extreme abuse in the H2A system, slavery, things like that, it's usually the labor contractors doing it. The other nice thing that farmers get from using temp agencies, in addition to convenience, there's also plausible deniability. As a farmer, you can hire H2A workers through a labor contractor, and then if it turns out that labor contractor was doing a slavery, it's not your fault. Technically, if a labor contractor is doing crimes in slavery on your farm, you can be liable as the farmer, but that prosecution is rarely actually done. I do believe that is part of why farmers were so eager to vote for Trump, though, was because he promised them that he would not do that. He promised that if someone is doing slavery on your farm, you will not be prosecuted. That was part of the bargain. Part of the 2024 anti-slavery reforms was going to be more enforcement with farms. If you hire a labor contractor and they're doing a slavery on your farm, you could be liable for that. And that was really upsetting to a lot of folks in the farm sector because they said, well, how can I know? How could I possibly know? And my answer to that would be, well, if it's your property, who's in charge of what's happening there? If it's not you, who's in charge? My feeling is, as a small farmer and as an employer, if you cannot take responsibility for what's happening in your own business, what are we even doing here? Who do you think you are? And I know it's really easy to say, well, but you're a farmer. This could happen to you. Maybe that's part of why I am so firm about this. If I am on record saying this should not be done, then I'm holding myself accountable to behave better than that, to not take those shortcuts. So I think it's really important to be on record as a farmer that I don't think we should be doing this. I think we should be able to take responsibility for what's happening on our own properties because we're always talking about how we're fierce and independent and, hardworking and, we really understand what's going on. But as soon as someone asks us to actually live up to all that, it's no, we couldn't possibly know. We couldn't possibly. Well, which is it? Are we helpless little babies? Or are we the big bad adults we keep telling people we are? We got to figure this out. So we got to talk about these 2024 anti-slavery reforms because I think this provided a lot of the oomph for the farm sector to really come out rooting for Trump. They were already like that, but it got everybody extra energized. So let's talk about what was in those 2024 anti-slavery reforms. A lot of it was really basic stuff, like, seriously, don't take people's passports. For a very simple reason, if people are supposed to be documented, they need to have their documents. Another one of the big anti-slavery reforms was, if you were caught doing slavery to H2A workers, you can't hire H2A workers anymore. Now that seems like common sense to me. But something H2A contractors would do is if they got caught, they could be temporarily banned from hiring H2A workers. And so they would just dissolve the company and then reincorporate the same people, the same owners of the company would just start a new company and then apply for H2A workers all over again. Part of the 2024 reforms was no more of that. If you're caught abusing the system, you need to get out of the system. There's also like basic hygiene standards for housing that was reemphasized because that keeps getting left off. If people want to talk to their priest about what's going on, if they're like, man, I need some pastoral counsel, you have to let them. Which to me seems like basic freedom of religion, but that one also ruffled a lot of feathers in the H-2A contractor world. I've heard of farmers who felt so strongly about not wanting their workers to talk to their pastor or their priest that they hired workplace chaplains, a listening ear you can trust in the workplace, so that information about what's going on there never makes it out. So the employer gets to hear about complaints before anybody else does. That's just a fascinating behavior. But yeah, that was one of the things, is if people want to talk to their priest, you have to go let them. And yes, even if the workers are living on your property, you are now a rental housing owner, if that's what you did. And so there's tenants' rights that should go along with that. That was a big source of friction. We had a lot of employers keeping people in bunkhouses on their own property and then insisting that, like, well, union organizers can't come here because that's my property. Priests can't come here because this is my property. If you have rental property as a landlord, which is what you are now, if you're keeping people on your property, there's certain things you have to do as a landlord, like let priests come visit, And so there are a lot of cases of people trying to use their power as a landlord, not just an employer, but a landlord over these people. There were enough cases of employers also making themselves landlords for these people and using their leverage as landlords over them, not just employers, to help keep them captive. That was happening enough that had to be part of the anti-slavery reforms. So that was in there as well. There's some other stuff in there like, hey, you got to have seatbelts. You can't just throw people into the back of a pickup and blast off down the highway. Just dumb little stuff like that, where it's very easy as a farm employer to go, but I'm a farm. You don't understand. It's not that formal out here. Versus, no, if you're blasting down the highway, seatbelts actually are important. It's actually not cool to do that to people just because you think they belong to you. So when the federal government does something like puts anti-slavery reforms into an H-2A program, they will have a comment period. They're not just going to say, here are all these new laws, take it or leave it. They're going to say, here's what we would like to change. Let's have a comment period. For all the people who actually work in the sector, let us know, if there's unforeseen side effects to this that we should know about, let us know now, right? So that's a comment period. The comments for these 2024 anti-slavery reforms were wild. If you go and look in there, most of the comments were coming from H-2A contractors, not farmers. And so we have, I think, without people realizing it, we have a big brand new interest group in agriculture. It's not corporate agribusiness the way people are used to thinking of it. It's not the meat companies. It's not Cargill and ADM and the grain handlers. It is a whole new interest group of people whose job is low-key human trafficking. And when we came out with anti-slavery reforms, they got up in arms about it. As a farmer, as someone who may wind up employing people through H-2A at some point, just because that's the system that we have in place for it, as an employer, I don't want to be competing with slavery. I don't want that, I don't find that moral or financial calculation actually that difficult to do. It's kind of wild how many people have really just felt like this is a personal assault on them. We got to start wrapping this thing up. There are 3 things Trump has done to make abusing the H-2A system to the point of slavery much easier in the United States. First off, those 2024 anti-slavery reforms he rolled back in June of 2025. Second, he cut down on the minimum wage. Every year, there is a survey that is done to determine what the minimum wage for H-2A should be. Within the last few days of recording this, they rolled out a whole new kind of math they use to calculate that, and wouldn't you know it, it is $2 to $3 per hour less. So that's the second big important change they've made to the H-2A system. And third, now that we have made slavery easier and cut the minimum wage, we have declared that we have to rapidly expand this H-2A program now that it's a lot more lax. And why do we have to rapidly expand this lax H-2A program? Well, because there's no farm workers anymore. This is an emergency. Well, how did that happen? And so this is the thing that some farm worker groups have been trying to point out. I think the attention has really gone to the ICE raids, right? Because the ICE raids are out in public. They are very visible. There are armed thugs marching through our streets, disappearing people, right? That's pretty hard to miss. But you got to understand that these ICE raids are not about getting immigrants out of the country. They're not about getting rid of immigrants. Farmers are always going to have their workers. How? How do farmers get their workers? We want to change how farmers are getting their workers. Instead of freelance undocumented people, we want to push the farm workforce towards H-2A. Because we just made all these little changes to make H-2A a lot more accommodating to employers, to make it a lot easier to get away with stuff. So you don't have to even try to pay people as much anymore. So this is something that farm worker groups have been trying to draw some attention to. Yes, the ICE raids are happening, but why? There is a larger strategy here, and that is to push farm labor towards H-2A, where now you can, low-key, you can enslave people and not get in a lot of trouble for it. We did find that this program was really prone to slavery already. Put in some fixes, and Trump has already rolled those fixes back. So again, the ICE raids are a very important and very visible story, but they are only half the story. The other half is forced labor. I don't think it's unrealistic to think some of the folks being imprisoned in places like Alligator Alcatraz are also going to be put to work. That is prison labor. And to be clear, it's not really convict labor if they haven't been convicted of anything. That's just, at that point, that's just state-sponsored human trafficking if you're put to work without a conviction or a sentence. But even prison labor programs are only half the story. This is part of a big effort to push farm labor into H-2A, which is a much easier to control category. Because before, undocumented workers could leave. They're freelance. If the job's bad, you can hit the bricks. And that was apparently not working out for a lot of U.S. farm employers. They really liked H-2A because once people were there and they couldn't leave. That was really appealing, but they didn't like how you had to pay people. The H-2A program made you pay a minimum wage that was competitive with Americans and was starting to have some basic anti-slavery provisions. Didn't really like that. So we've rolled all those protections back, and now we're going to massively expand the program. H-2A stories are kind of hard to tell because it's kind of an arcane government program. Now we're diving into the inner drama of visa systems, right? But you got to understand, there's slavery in this country, and we are doing things that will make it great again. That is the other half of this story. The ICE raids really do not make a lot of sense unless you consider what they're being used to push people into. So that is the other half of this, and it is very important. I want a farm sector that can square itself with freedom. I want a farm sector that is going to have upward mobility. So there's a point for people who want to work hard in the United States to get into agriculture and work hard. There should be a point to working hard, and agriculture should be one of those places where there's a point. I don't think the farm sector should be happy with dead-end jobs. I don't think we should be satisfied with that. I think we should challenge ourselves to more. Not all of my colleagues agree with that, and that is where this has gotten us. It has gotten us a willingness to support an autocrat. It has gotten us willingness to support a dictator. It has made the farm sector willing to support a wannabe dictator who at this point has already put armed thugs on our streets, putting people in prison, and making slavery great again. Every dictator in the world, no matter how much they're abusing their country, there are people in their country who benefit from it. That's why they get support. They can't stay in power just by themselves. Every dictator in the world has a small group of people somewhere in their country that they are rewarding really, really handsomely for supporting them. And as a farmer, it is very upsetting to see agriculture become that group. And I think we're seeing in some ways how well it's paying off for us. And for other people in the farm sector, it's not paying off so well right now. I expect they'll probably be rewarded in some way anyway. The bailouts are still up in the air, and I don't necessarily want to speculate on which direction that's going to go. But you can see why people who would want a bailout are supporting this guy, because he's promised them that. I know agriculture has really built itself this reputation of, well, we are the beating heart of democracy. Fierce, independent farmers. And we have done, I feel like, everything we can to shred and destroy that reputation. And I really wish my colleagues maybe had thought more about the fallout and how much farmers have relied on the public rooting for us, basically. We might not always feel like they do, but they do. And we are doing everything we can right now to throw generations of goodwill down the toilet. It's just good when we think through the long-term consequences of the things we do for ourselves and for other people, and how that might pay off for us in the long run. I grew up in a really conservative household where we were always talking about the law of unintended consequences. And, the law of unintended consequences is not just for folks in the city. It's for all of us. That's what you need to know about what's going on in farm labor right now. The ICE raids are only half the story. Here's the other half. There will be more news on this, and this story will be evolving, I am sure. If you're still listening to this, thanks for listening. If you like well-informed inside farm news that is not in lockstep with the farm lobby and with the big guys, like and subscribe. And let's all make good choices out there, everybody.